Want to learn how to put your block on point? Or maybe you want to make a block larger for a particular project. Stay tuned and see how you can quickly stretch your quilt block into a bigger square. To place or set a block on point, you'll need 4 triangles. To set a 6-inch block, these triangles must measure 5 1/4 inches on 2 sides. At the end of the video, I'll show you how I calculated that measurement and how you can calculate these corner triangles for any size block. From your fabric, you'll cut 2 squares 5 1/4 by 5 1/4. Make sure your fabric has been pressed and the straight of grain and cross grain are on the outside edges of your square. Then cut your squares on the diagonal. If you notice, I've taken my square and I've lined it up on the diagonal line on my mat. This makes it easier for me to keep everything nice and straight. Fold the triangle and press the halfway mark. Be careful not to pull this edge because this is bias and it'll stretch. If your block doesn't have a midway point, fold your block in half and press those areas. Put right sides together. Line up this pressing line with that seam line. I'm ready to take this over to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch. I want to keep this bias edged on top of my patchwork so as not to be stretched by these feed dogs. I prefer not to pin this, but it's okay if you feel more comfortable pinning. I'll be sewing a 1/4 inch seam. I like to start with a little scrap of fabric. Then I'll put my piece right up. Here's my second triangle. I like to sew these 2 triangles first. I'll press to the outside edge. Before I press these last 2 triangles, I want to show you what you're trying to achieve. If your block has points in the corner that need to be matched, you'll want to make sure that everything lines up before you go over to press. If your tips don't line up in the corner, then you'll have to rip this seam out, or you'll just have to learn to live with it. So it looks pretty good. I'll take it over and press those back. I've pressed my block, but before I square this up, I'll need at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each one of these points. I could use this 18-inch ruler to trim my block, but I prefer to use this larger square. When I square up this block, I like to make sure that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here and a 1/4 inch seam allowance up there. Turn my square. I like to line up my trimmed edges on a vertical and on a horizontal line. There's my 1/4 inch mark, and up here, I want a 1/4 inch mark up there also. Let's see, but this line doesn't look so straight. This block should measure about 9 inches, so here's the 9-inch mark all the way around. Let me just get that in there, and I'm ready to trim. Here's my completed block. You can add a back, batting, and binding to make a little table topper. Or I often use this technique to stretch my project from a 12-inch square to a 20-inch table topper. Add borders and stretch your 6-inch blocks even further. In this next section, I'll explain how I got my measurements and how you can use this info to figure out cutting measurements for any size block. If the thought of a mathematical formula makes you ill, you can always search the internet under corner triangles. Just make sure you check out the measurements on a practice block before you cut out a whole quilt and find out the measurements weren't correct. So you can see that there's many different ways to calculate the size of these corner triangles, but no matter what method you use, you're always going to need to start with the finished size of your block. Sometimes folks get confused and they think it's the size of their unfinished block. My unfinished block is 6.5 inches because I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the outside edges. Finished size of my block is 6 inches because when I sewed, those seam allowances were taken up. This is the measurement that I used in my calculations. I took the finished size, which is 6 inches, and I divided that finished size by 1.41. I came up with a very long number on the calculator. Then I added an inch to that. Some quilters like to add 7/8 of an inch, but I like a little extra for squaring up. Then I rounded off my number to 5.25, which happens to be 5.25 inches. I cut 2 squares that size, and then I cut each on the diagonal. If you would like a copy of any of the handouts used in this video, please email me at learnquilting@gmail.com. You might also like our series on half-square triangles. Go to learnhowtoquilt.com, click on Beginner Basics, and scroll down to Piecing and Cutting Shortcuts. Please share our videos with your friends. Thanks.